Welcome to Que Pasa, HSIs, a podcast dedicated to everything Hispanic-serving institutions. I'm your host, Doctora Gina English Garcia, bringing you the news on what's happening in HSIs. Join us as we explore the history and evolution of HSIs, culturally relevant and liberatory practices, current and emerging research with HSIs, and the policies that shape servingness.
Saludos HSI familia, and welcome back to Que Pasa HSIs. Today we are in conversation with four phenomenal scholars. Stacey Speller is a dedicated scholar-practitioner at an HBCU and proud Nuyorican, deeply committed to challenging anti-Black narratives that impact legislation affecting mission-driven institutions with dual designations, HBCUs and HSIs, or institutions that can be called historically Black Hispanic-serving institutions, or HBHSIs. Her research focuses on exploring policies and practices at HBCUs that support the educational goals and outcomes of Afro-Latine students. She has over a decade of experience in admissions, retention, and student success, and seeks to implement effective strategies that address the unique opportunities and challenges Afro-Latine students face at HBCUs. She's joined by Dr. Dwuana Bradley, who is an assistant professor at the USC Rossier School of Education. Dr. Bradley's research broadly examines the way anti-Blackness sentiment perpetually undergirds the drivers and levers of federal, state, and institutional policies across P20 pipeline in ways that unintentionally reify the social stratification of Black peoples across the diaspora. Her work employs theories of anti-Blackness, socio-legal concepts, and critical qualitative methodologies to address issues of policy affecting Black education at the K-12 and post-secondary level. Dr. Gina is also joining us. Dr. Gina English Tillis is an interdisciplinary scholar practitioner who centers identities, culture, and histories within educational experiences, research, curriculum, and instruction. Dr. Tillis has over a decade of experience shaping educational experiences at various HSIs, HBCUs, and emerging HSI HBCUs. Beyond the university, Dr. Tillis co-founded two nonprofit organizations, Blackshear Bridge in Austin, Texas, and the Memphis 13 Foundation in Memphis, Tennessee, dedicated to serving the educational needs of their respective communities. Dr. Tillis and Dr. Bradley recently obtained funding from a Spencer Foundation to co-develop a theoretical framework and conduct research on Hispanic-serving HBCUs. And finally, Dr. Natalie Muñoz is an Afro-Latina assistant professor within the College of Arts and Sciences at Rutgers University Newark's social work department. With a fervent dedication to fostering inclusivity and promoting social justice, Dr. Muñoz has emerged as a pivotal figure in advancing the retention and success of underserved students in higher education. Her research interests center around Afro-Latine identity, development, mental health equity, and educational justice. Notably, her groundbreaking dissertation, Soy de aquí y de allá, exploring how historically Black colleges and universities contribute to ethnic, racial identity and mental health of Afro-Latino, Latina, Latine, Latinx college students, earned her recognition as a second-place finalist for Outstanding Dissertation of the Year by American Association of Hispanics in Higher Education. You're in for a treat today, y'all. Thanks for tuning in. Amigas, thank you for joining us today here on Que Pasa HSIs, where we talk about all things HSIs. And today we're going to talk about all things HSIs and HBCUs. So let's go ahead and start with that servingness journey question. We're going to bring Stacey in first to tell us about her servingness journey.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Gina, for having me on the podcast. I listen to it all the time. So this is like a dream come true to be here. So thank you for opening up the space for the historically Black college university that's also a Hispanic serving institution. So my name is Stacey Speller. I go by she, her, ella. I'm originally from the Bronx, New York, by ways of Daytona Beach, Florida. My HBCU Nuyorican-ness is an identity that I wear through and through, right? So my higher education journey began at Bethune-Cookman University, a small private four-year liberal arts HBCU that showed me exactly what true servingness looked like, right? Like the sense of community, support, dedication to student success. I experienced there was like unparalleled, right? So at BCU, servingness was not just a concept, it was like a lived reality, right? And then I get into my PhD journey at Howard University. I'm doing higher ed leadership policy studies, another HBCU. That was an intentional decision because of my experiences in undergrad and for my graduate program. So now I'm here and I'm reading all about HSIs and servingness and your work. And I'm like, what is this? I don't even know what this means. Why is this even a concept, right? Because my lived experiences weren't kind of saying what the literature was saying, right? About like this idea of trying to get to servingness. And so with that being said, it piqued my interest. It was something that I wanted to kind of dive down the rabbit hole and see what, what the scholarship was saying and how that matched or unmatched my lived experiences, both as a student, as an admissions counselor working for my alma mater, as a retention specialist, right? And how does this actually work? But truly, once I found out about the HBCU-HSI, right? That was my first semester in my PhD program. I was like, there's something here, right? And I ran with it. Now I'm in my third year, just finished my third year, and I'm just continuing to find other scholars in the space. Shout out to my homies on the podcast. And just, and so we're here. We're here today to talk about it. So I'm excited. Thank you.
Yes, excellent. Natalie, let's bring you in. Same question. Tell us about your servingness journey.
Yes, thank you so much again for having us. And so I love Stacey's introduction because I also met Stacey at an HBCU. Stacey and I both attended Howard University in Washington, D.C. And actually, for my undergrad, I went to Stony Brook University. And so I think having worked in higher education for the last 20 years, working at predominantly white institutions, I experienced a lot of institutional harm, a lot of sexism, a lot of racism. And that really led me to wanting to be at a university for my doctorate degree that had a genuine connection and belief in servingness. And so that's why I decided to go to a historically Black college and university for my final degree. So I recently graduated last year with my doctorate in social work from Howard University. And it was definitely an honor to graduate from Howard. I wish I would have known about HBCUs in undergrad, but unfortunately, due to systemic racism, they're not often pushed by academic counselors. But I'm happy that I was at least able to experience it in my doctoral journey. And actually right now, I'm currently serving as a faculty member in the social work department at a Hispanic-serving institution, Rutgers University, its Newark campus. So I'm excited to be here and to contribute to the podcast and to, institutions and their servingness.
Yes, awesome. Let's bring Gina in. Same question, servingness journey.
Hey y'all, so I'm from Oceanside, California. I grew up in Black and brown communities my whole life. My family's from Black and brown communities. My parents are Black and brown. And I attended HBCU for undergrad. And then I went back to California. I attended an HSI, Cal State San Marcos, and I worked at an HSI. And then I got a position at a HBCU that is what we call an emerging HBCU. So I taught there for 7 years, and I'm just really committed to serving Black and brown students. And so my servingness comes from my experiences at both HBCUs and HSIs. And I'm just really glad to be a part of this conversation.
All right, Dwuana, you're next. Servingness journey.
Yes. Thank you for inviting me in, Gina, and to my beloved Gina. Thank you for teeing me up. It's because my servingness journey began at the same institution where I met Gina. So the first HSI that I ever went to was the University of Texas at Austin for my master's degree in educational leadership and my PhD, which I did straight out of the gate following my master's in educational leadership and policy. Before then, unfortunately for me, it was all predominantly white institutions. And like Natalie mentioned, that had a lot to do with my family's socioeconomic background. Although I really, really, really had my eyes set, my heart set on Spelman, I couldn't even apply to that HBCU coming out of high school, I should say, because we just didn't have money like that. At that time in my life, we had not even been to, or for me personally, I had not even been on family vacations outside of my home state. So with that said, it meant I could not think about being admitted to a school in Georgia and having to travel back and forth between breaks, or even to get there for the initial fall, semester and come home by the end of the year, right? So I attended Truman State University, which is my alma mater in the middle of Kirksville, Missouri. I'm sure many of you have never heard of that city. It is a very small, rural, predominantly white space near Mizzou, which is in Columbia, Missouri, our bigger flagship institution. So we like to say that the smarty pants go to Truman, though. So it was my first space of like being invited to be a part of a counter space in a predominantly white space that was research focused. And that's how I became interested in studying erased experiences in all institutions of higher education. So for me now today, I focus on policy issues and organizational behavior that is perpetuated by anti-Black sentiment.
Whew, we got a panel here for y'all today. I'm so excited to be in community with y'all. Just hearing your entry points, right, and your journeys into this conversation is just beautiful. So thank y'all for being here. This conversation is so important because we haven't fully written about and talked about historically Black colleges that become, right, emerged to HSI. So, and y'all are the leading scholars doing it. So we got the right folks. I also have to acknowledge, obviously, this is a great time to be talking about HBCUs in general, because Vice President Kamala Harris is running for president, right? And it's elevating HBCUs. We know that.
Come on.
Right? So we are staying right here in the current conversations. And I think it's such an important way to elevate the MSI conversation is when we're seeing it, right? Like in political spheres. So let's talk about historically Black HSIs or historically Black colleges that become HSIs. We're going to talk about terminology as well. But Stacey, can you first define what it means to be duly designated as both HBCU and HSI?
Yeah, absolutely. So in order to answer that question, first we need to look at the definition of an HBCU. Then we look at the definition of an HSI, which I'm sure many of your listeners already know. And then I could give you our definition of what it means to be both HBCU and HSI, right? So Congress defines HBCUs in Title III, Part B, Section 322 of the Higher Education Act as an institution of higher education that was accredited and established before 1964 and whose principal mission was the education of African Americans, right? So that's the definition we have for HBCUs. Now, the definition we have for HSIs, also Congress defines HSIs in Title V, Part A, Section 502 of the Higher Education Act as an institution of higher education whose enrollment of undergraduate full-time equivalent students is at least 25% Hispanic students, and where at least 50% of the degree students enrolled are receiving need-based assistance from Title IV, right? So now when you put those two definitions together, a historically Black Hispanic-serving institution would be an HBCU as defined by Title III, Part B of the Higher Education Act, whose enrollment of undergraduate full-time equivalent students is at least 25% Hispanic students, and where at least 50% of the degree students that are enrolled receive that need-based assistance from Title IV. And just to give you like a quick snapshot on the socioeconomic status of students attending HBCUs, the National Center of Education Statistics reports that 90% of all undergraduate students at HBCUs receive some type of financial aid, right? So like when we're talking about, HBCUs meeting that 50% needy, quote unquote, right, needy student threshold, that's all of them, right? So so that's how we define it.
Okay, whew, I'm gonna have to listen to that a couple of times and take notes. But thank you for giving us the exact definition through the Higher Education Act. So from your research and what you know so far, how many are HBCUs that are also eligible as HSIs, and or if you know the amount emerging HSIs as well?
Right, yeah. So we get this data from iPads, right? So as of fall of 2022, when we're looking at the enrollment numbers, right? where we have College Número Uno, we like to call it College Número Uno, located in Austin, Texas, has an enrollment of 25%, right? 25.1 to be exact. College Número Dos in San Antonio, Texas, has an enrollment population of Latinos 65%, right? So those two would be technically eligible, right, federally, under that HBCU-HSI threshold, right? But are not like identified through the Department of Education as eligible dual designated institutions, right? When we're looking at like the Excelencia's definition of emerging, right? We know that that's not technically a federal designation, but a lot of scholars will use that emerging HSI terminology to define institutions that are, you know, just about that number to achieve that HSI designation. And if we look at that 15 to 24.99%, right, IPEDS records that there are two more institutions that could fit the category: College Número Tres out in Hawkins, Texas, and College Cuatro in Washington, D.C., right? So right now, you've got two that technically could be eligible, right, because they meet that 25% threshold, and then two on the rise, you know, that would be emerging, even though we know that that's not a federal designation.
Okay, so with that, the next question, the layered of making sure we understand the complications, are from the federal perspective, you're saying that you're not allowed to be duly designated, and does that therefore mean you cannot get funding from both of those streams? Is that correct?
Yeah, right, like technically no, right? Because and my sister Dwuana is very good with the special rule, but you know, according to the Department of Education, right, you cannot be both, right? In terms of federal funding, and Dwuana will definitely break down what that looks like because there's a special rule in Title V, right? However, what I did want to make note was that the Department of Ed pulls data every year. They release a eligibility matrix, right? And in that eligibility matrix, it breaks down all of the MSIs. And there's one HB-HSI that shows up as an eligible HSI for the years 2024, 2023, and 2022. But prior to that, they don't show up on the list, right? But it's very convoluted because the data doesn't seem consistent, right? So I'm just gonna leave that there, right? And let because it's a little, but to your point, no, right? Like they cannot be both federally and cannot get the funding federally. And Dwuana, I don't know if you want to chime in a little bit to talk about what that looks like.
Yeah, I mean, you named it a little bit there, Stacey. It's Special Rule 505 that precludes all Title III designated institutions from receiving federal Title V funds despite eligibility criteria being met. So these institutions do, to the degree that their university resources and capacity allow, seek indicators that they are safe havens for these students in the ways that you identified through Excelencia, IPED signaling, etc.
Okay, whew. This is helpful because then we know what we're talking about. And part of me is thinking, okay, this episode and the work y'all are doing is to advocate. I don't know if that's accurate, right? To advocate that, like, we should be able to be duly designated, right? That's what it sounds like. I mean, obviously, I'm gonna jump into that space as well. As like, well, yeah, it gets complicated when you have these dual designations emerging because of population changes, right? Which is what we're seeing, obviously, with HBCUs that become HSIs. So, all right, so that's, I think, something for us to think about is like, and particularly listeners, is like, how are we going to advocate for this being an important dual designation that we should be talking about a little bit more? And with that, is there research already on these HBCU-HSI designation crossing, even if it's not technically a designation? Stacey, talk to us about that, about any empirical sort of work that's going on.
Yeah, so I just gotta shout out my girls, Dwuana and Gina Tillis, because it's forthcoming, right? Like they hit the nail on the head when it comes to organizational identity, what it means to be that HBE-HSI, HB-HSI, right? So it's not out yet in terms of what we're discussing, But there is some empirical research that speaks to more so in the HBCU space that HBCUs in terms of recruitment should be looking to recruit more in that Latinx Hispanic space, in terms of like, and I hate the way they frame it because it's very deficit, like to survive you need to start looking at a different population so that our enrollment numbers can grow, right? And they actually highlight some of the institutions that we're highlighting in this episode as being, a space where this can happen because the numbers are growing, in states specifically like Texas, right? Or Florida, where we know the demographics of Latinos and Hispanics are really, really high, and that there are a lot of HBCUs that exist in these spaces, right? So to your point, like nothing empirical yet, but I think Gina and Dwuana will talk a little bit about, some of the data that is coming, forthcoming when it comes to this institutional identity.
Okay. And then your dissertation, of course, the future doctora.
That part. Yes. Thank you. Yes.
I was about to
still
chime
coming.
in and be like, yeah. And future doctora Stacey Speller.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Also forthcoming.
Also forthcoming. Yes.
Yes,
Awesome.
I'm loving the hypeness. Thank you, y'all. Because listen, this journey is cray.
We're going to get you there. Don't worry. Gina, then let's go ahead and bring you in and talk a little bit more about maybe some of this forthcoming work. And also one of the things I wanted to talk about is the complications of being, right? Like, particularly as I talked about advocating, right, for this dual designation, politically what's going to happen is people are going to come and say, what are the tensions in a historically Black space, as we know, saying we historically, right, over 100 years have been doing this work, and HSIs that we know are still predominantly white spaces, right? I'm going to say it because we know it's true, right? They're trying to figure it out. What are the tensions of being dually designated?
Thank you, Gina. That's such a good question. I think what's important to note is that, historically Black colleges really draw from this epistemology that understands knowledge as inclusive and shared in service of the community. And it's also important that we just understand, first off, HBCUs have never been exclusive. We have always included various communities. You can look in the archives from various, yearbooks and just different things. And you'll see that, not only were Black students attending these schools, but you also have Latinx, Indigenous, white students, women who were not allowed to attend school. And this is reflective of not only their students, but their faculty and staff. And they have some of the most diverse faculty and staff among higher education institutions. In addition to that, these institutions are grounded in spirituality. There's a liberation element to it. Black people literally risk their life and limb to learn and get an education. So it's drawing from that framework. It's drawing from that framework of liberation and community building. And the faculty, staff, and admin at these institutions have this curriculum orientation and understand education, right? Its meaning, value, and purpose as in service of the community. And so when you see various studies, like the Gallup study shows that Black HBCU graduates, are more likely to be thriving in their purpose. It's because of this particular testament. It's also because, for Black students, this might be the only time period in their entire life they have an opportunity to engage, right, in an educational space that, allows them to be, I guess embraces, right, unapologetically, right, their Blackness, and gives them a space to critically and speculatively talk about what it means to know and be in an anti-Black world, and foster this racial identity development and instill this critical consciousness and collective struggle against colonial oppression. And so it's really important for that space. And because, Black students don't have these spaces, just in most educational institution, it's really protected. And so this is something that, we, as we're thinking about, not just serving historically Black community, but also emerging as, Hispanic serving institutions, we have to really tend to this, right? Because it is protected, is what Jelani Favors calls a shelter in the storm, from the storm. It's protected, and we have to acknowledge the sacred space as it does that. But we also have to build capacity to be both historically Black and Hispanic serving, just like, you can be Black and brown too, in radically inclusive ways.
Yeah, I actually want to add to that a little bit in terms of the servingness of HBCUs for Latinx communities. It just makes me think really much about the Tuskegee Institute, where like Afro-Puerto Ricans and Afro-Cubans still didn't have access to education, and were working with Booker T. Washington, who was an African American in the United States, and creating solidarity and movements to bring Afro-Latinos to HBCUs to be educated, right? And so I think a lot of times people think that this is like something new, but the reality is that although it may not have been talked about, and it may, Afro-Latinos tend to be erased from curriculums and the history, that this history is there of serving Latinx communities at HBCUs since their inception.
Absolutely, yes. And y'all's answers have me just thinking about, one, the way I freedom dream about HSIs is exactly the way y'all just described HBCUs, right? And this idea, like Gina, like you said, that HBCUs have always been inclusive. And like the number one question I get with HSIs, y'all, honestly, if I had $1 for every time this got asked, I mean, I'd have a piggy bank growing for sure. I wouldn't be rich, but I'd have a big piggy bank growing, is, what about every other student, right? There's an assumption that HSI is exclusive. And I'm like, yo, it's 25%, right? There's still 75%. It's not going to become exclusive. And yeah, if we learn from HBCUs are not exclusive either, right? It's the acknowledgement that you're entering a space of liberation, right? A space where the students' lived experiences at the center, at the core. So whew, y'all got me already like over here, like, yes, I need people to listen and understand this can happen, right? With HSIs, HBCUs have arrived in that sort of space, not to say that they're not still growing and emerging in different ways, but such an important way to think about MSIs as inclusive. They don't have to be exclusive, right, to the one group that we're centering, right? That's all it is. We're centering the group. So thank you both for that. The other thing, of course, that is sort of lingering and coming up, right, which we're going to bring Natalie in to talk about, is this idea that Latinos are at HBCUs and Black people are at HSIs, right? Like 100%. We know this. The data are clear. We know that. Yet there's a need to talk about that, right? How do HBCUs adequately serve Latina students? And also the intersection, right, of our mixed race students, right? Gina talked about Black and brown students. I'm a mother of Black and brown kids. I'm like, yes, talk about it. And Afro-Latina students, right? Like that there is this mixing, right, of students at their identities level. So Natalie, talk to us. What do we know so far empirically about how to serve Afro-Latina students and Latina students at HBCUs?
Yeah, so I'm really excited because actually my dissertation was on this topic. I specifically looked at how HBCUs shape the ethnic racial identity, but also mental health of Afro-Latina college students. And so what I found through my research was that the students who attended the HBCU were able to gain more of a knowledge of self, which led to critical consciousness, but also healing, right? Healing from anti-Blackness, healing from lateral oppression, right? Because they understood that lateral oppression was coming from a place of ignorance and not that they actually didn't belong at the university. So, for example, would be like, oh, you're not Black, right? Because for Afro-Latinos, a lot of times we fall in between the cusp of Latinidad and Blackness, right? So if you have an accent, then you may not be Black enough, right? Or if you don't speak Spanish, then you're not Latina enough, right? And so I think being at an HBCU also helped them to realize that there's just so much diversity, both within Latinidad, within Afro-Latinidad, and within Blackness and within HBCUs, right? So depending on where the HBCU was located, geopolitically made a difference in the students' experiences with xenophobia on campus, right? Or made differences in their experiences around belonging. But for the most part, the students said that, having gone through, familial issues around like skin tone, colorism, and also having experienced issues around accepting their own hair type, that being at their HBCU and surrounded by the diversity of the diaspora allowed them to just love themselves, right? That they felt so safe that they could finally just be a political science major, or just be a mathematician, or just be a psychologist. And they didn't actually have to think about what that meant to be a Black psychologist in the United States, right? Or to be a Black social worker, or to be a Black scientist. So it just really created this space. And obviously it's not perfect. Even HBCUs have room for growth, right? In terms of their inclusion and in terms of creating systems where we can identify even Afro-Latinos on campus, right? Because federal government requires us to collect data that doesn't necessarily always include Afro-Latinidad. And so that's a challenge for all universities, but definitely, there's room for improvement at HBCUs as well. But overall, the students really, really felt a strong connection to their HBCU, a strong sense of belonging, and definitely Black empowerment from their engagement with the faculty, with other students, with the curriculum. And so it was really an amazing opportunity to interview them, to learn about their journeys, and also share in my own journey at my HBCU.
Yes, and future articles are going to be coming out from Doctora Muñoz about this topic. So follow along. Obviously, the dissertation we can, you're probably working on that, right? That we want to learn more from you. So you got me thinking about like your dissertation is interesting because I think that doesn't always happen at HSIs, right? We don't hear those same stories. There are multiple articles about Latinx students, Black students, Afro-Latinx students, Indigenous students, Asian students saying they don't feel that sense of belonging or that the environment was good for them. So what are your suggestions based on some of your research for people that are listening in HSI spaces? Like what can we learn and how do we create spaces so that our students say exactly the things you heard in your narrative?
Yeah. Honestly, we need to diversify the faculty. I'm actually, I said earlier, I'm at Rutgers University, and Rutgers New Brunswick campus is actually a PWI, but their Newark campus is an HSI, which is a really interesting climate. But one of the things that I think is so important is having that diverse faculty, bringing in those diverse perspectives into the classroom. And what I loved about, working at Rutgers was I was part of a Latinx cluster hire, where they hired around, I think, 6 to 8 faculty who were of Latinx identity, and they placed them in different departments all over the Newark campus, right? And so we need, even though obviously that doesn't solve everything, but we need more Latinx faculty so that we can have more inclusive curriculum, so that students can feel more connected, right? But also I think in terms of when I think of, Black and Brown solidarity, right? We need transnational curriculums that speak to, I feel like I didn't learn about the Tuskegee Institute until I went to an HBCU. And this is history. It's not just HBCU history, it's American history. It's Latinx history. So they shouldn't be specific to just HBCUs. I think HSIs can learn so much from HBCU curriculums, even right now.
Preach.
Even right now as a professor, I'm taking so much of what I learned from my HBCU and bringing it to my classrooms here at Rutgers Newark. So for example, in the spring 2025, I'm teaching a class called, cultivating your authentic self and reclaiming diasporic wellness, right? As an opportunity for students to really reclaim their history So it's going to be taught almost like an independent study where I'm not necessarily pushing any articles on my students, but they get to pick either a transnational movement, a solidarity movement, a part of their identity and history that they're most curious about. And they can select their own readings, right? And then we'll come together in terms of a collective to talk about what collective wellness looks like in the diaspora through an exhibit, right? And so I'm just like really excited to kind of bring that to the HSI community at Newark. But I just really wish that it wasn't like just me, right? Like I want to see like this kind of culturally relevant curriculum infused in all the different fields within HSIs, right? So if your university has a lot of Dominicans, we should be thinking about Dominican history. Or if your university is placed somewhere where there's a lot of Chicanos, then we should be thinking about how do we infuse Chicano history, right? There's just so much research that shows that if you have a positive knowledge of self, that leads to higher academic excellence, a more positive self-esteem, even more positive just behaviors in the classrooms, right? And so it's telling, right, as to why they're trying to erase Black history in the South, because they know how powerful knowing who you are, who your ancestors are, and where you came from is.
Woo!
I know.
The
I have to
room
get
is
off this
exploding.
grill.
I was holding it in like,
exploding.
That's beautiful.
yes,
Drop the mic,
yes.
walk
My
away.
God.
Okay,
Yes.
that's what you get from an HBCU education, okay?
Right.
Yeah.
And seeing my HSI freedom dreaming, I'm like, that's what we need to get from an HSI education, right? I'm like, what?
Yes.
Like, when are people going to walk away from the HSI saying that same stuff, right? Everything you're talking about is the liberatory outcomes, right? I talk about what about the liberatory outcomes, right? What about liberation? And all we care about is did they graduate or not? Like, no, there's so much more. There's so much more to a college experience, right? And you outlined them like so beautifully. Okay, so I want to go ahead and bring in the servingness framework, because of course I'm gonna always bring in the servingness framework into the podcast, because I like to think about how this theoretical framework that like me and others have created to try to think about how do HSIs move towards these spaces of liberation and justice, right? And whether or not it's applicable, right? So as we're talking about this HBCU-HSI crossover, right? This dual designation, I'm wondering if the servingness framework still applies. I'm going to give you an example. So I was at an AERA session, and Stacey called me out because I said that HSIs have predominantly white faculty. I was like, I didn't need to show you the data. Just believe me, right? I was like, HSIs all have predominantly white faculty, right? All 600 HSIs have predominantly white faculty. And Stacey said, no, ma'am, respectfully, HBCUs that become HSIs do not, right? And I was like, ooh, bet, I love that, right? I love when folks call me in and say, no, there's actually is some, some different spaces that maybe that doesn't apply. But the servingness framework would say you absolutely need to hire more faculty of color, right? So then maybe in an HBCU-HSI context, that's not the same sort of push, right? So I think that's what I'm thinking about here is like from the servingness perspective is like we're having to change the curriculum. That's huge, right? Natalie, you just laid out all these reasons why changing the curriculum matters. HSIs haven't got there, right? There is an extensive curriculum that allows students to have the experience you described. So those are the different things that come up in the servingness framework. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that, Natalie, or even Stacey, could call you in. I know you're familiar with the servingness framework on like what dimensions apply to the HBCU, HSI context, and then which ones wouldn't, right? That we wouldn't have to do as much transformation, right? HSIs are literally trying to transform everything, but the HBCU, HSI context maybe wouldn't have to do as much work. So what are y'all thoughts on that?
So we actually unpack this as a unit, right? Because we all have like ideas around what servingness, right, looks like, and we definitely all agree that it does look different, right, in these predominantly Black spaces, specifically at HBCU, right? And honestly, I think, I'm gonna, if it's okay, Gina, GT, I'm gonna call you in just because I feel like she so eloquently kind of conveys this. And this is a lot of the work that she does around the conceptual framework, around, you know, what, and she was faculty at like an institution that we're actually talking about, and actually did exactly what you're asking was what she was implementing, and she saw firsthand and received, you know, student response, student reaction, right, in terms of like serving this. So if it's okay, GT, I'm a hop it over to you. I'm gonna pass the ball to you.
Yes, of course. So yeah, this study that Dwuana and I research that we're doing is really, you know, birthed from my experiences teaching at Hispanic-serving HBCU for 7 years. And you know, when I first got there, we didn't have as many Latinx, you know, brown students. And then I started to notice an increase, you know, and I started to hear all these conversations about, you know, what happened? What if we become an HSI? What does that look like, you know? And my students were yearning, my brown students were yearning to see themselves, right, in class, because they have historically been denied access to their stories in the official curriculum, denied access to like engage in, you know, authentic conversations, right? And in ways that reflect their mother tongue. So I think about my mom's experience and my experience, you know, just kind of, you know, speaking Spanish in class, and how, you know, you get smacked if you speak Spanish in class, or if you sound like you're speaking Ebonics, and what that looks like. And so it's important that we first acknowledge that our students, our Black and Brown and Indigenous students too, you know, come from like a space where they have not had the best experiences with their K through 12 schooling. And I'm just going to give you some examples of things that I had just kind of came across. I typically teach sociology and ethnic studies and Africana studies. That's like my background, but I just recently got into urban education and cultural studies and education. And I was teaching I'm going to give you a couple examples. So I was teaching a sociology class, and my sociology was contemporary social problems. And we talk about the prison industrial complex a lot. This is really, you know, a big conversation and in classrooms. And so I paired that with conversations around the detention center industrial complex. Then I brought in some split labor theory, like, hey, you know, they have us thinking, right, that we're separate because they're trying to separate us and think that, you know, we're each other's problem. And then I grounded that within, like, you know, I want you guys to go out into the community and look at who's working where. Who's working where? What kind of services do they have to protect themselves as workers? And just like these conversations around what, you know, just the commonality of experiences were so important for my students. A lot of my students, they grew up in Black and brown communities, so they were comfortable feeling like they can engage in these questions authentically. Another thing that like probably was one of the biggest moments that I've had to really think about, you know, Afro-Latinidad, is I was teaching a course, and we were talking about fugitivity and marronage. And, you know, when you think about fugitivity and marronage, you tend to think about Harriet Tubman and, you know, Black people, you know, engaging in the Underground Railroad up north to Canada and following the North Star. So at the time period, I just so happened to be, you know, coming across some readings by Paul Ortiz. He has a history of African-American and Latinx, you know, book. And I was just so happened to reading it. And I was learning about the Underground Railroad to Mexico. And I started to talk with my students who, you know, here we are in Texas. And, you know, so many students had no idea that Black and brown people got together and created an underground railroad to Mexico. Why? Because the first president of Mexico is Afro-Latine, and he said, we're going to stop slavery. And so my students started to think about, you know, oh, you know, I had this one student, I have them write reflections, they're on the community, they're doing all these different things. And I had this student, we started, for this conversation evolved into like Blackness, right? Afro-Mexicans, right? And Black communities in Mexico. Then we started talking about, you know, mestiza and la cósmica, what is it? La raza cósmica. And then we talked about how that has elements of anti-Blackness. And then my students started to think, oh my goodness, I noticed, just like in my family, my mom's Mexicana, my mom's like sisters and brothers did chase the rainbow, One of my students was like, you know what? All my cousins and stuff, we have thick curly hair and brown skin. I think I might be, I might have some African ancestry. So it had a profound impact on just thinking about, just Afro-Latinidad in general, this diversity that Natalie brought up so beautifully, and, complicating, right, the H and complicating the B as well. And also adding this element, right? We're here in Texas on indigenous land, right? We all have indigenous blood, but we have this assumption that indigenous people do not exist, and so that's important for us to be unpacking, and especially as it relates to, protecting spaces and what does it mean to protect spaces, right, on indigenous land. And so having these conversations, it's also important for us as, to acknowledge that, we're going to have some tensions between groups because we have been framed that we're against each other, right? And we're going to have not only tension within groups, but within our own groups, right? And so at HBCU campuses, it's really important to create a brave space, right, where you can engage in these conversations about your ancestral history and what that means, right? We talk about, at HBCUs, we talk about double consciousness, but let's talk about mestizaje también, Let's see what that looks like as it relates to us in the settler colony that we live in. And so it was really a part of the work that this research that Dwuana and I are doing. I'm like doing my thing at this school, at this Hispanic-serving HBCU, and I'm taking this class, this Mexican education class with one of my favorite professor mentors, Luis Urrieta. And he assigns this piece, Afro-Latinidades, and I'm like, oh my gosh, like it really spoke to my experiences because everybody's like, oh, you can't, there's this tension. Are you Black? Are you brown? Like you can be both. You can be Hispanic serving and you can be Black, okay? So, but we have to really tend to it in radically inclusive ways. And when I was talking to Dwuana about it, she brought this really critical higher ed policy analysis. And so we were like, let's get together, let's do this. And we applied for the Spencer and we got it. And so Dwuana, if you want to add anything.
Big ups on that. That's a hard grant to get. So congrats on the Spencer grant.
Thank you.
Dwuana, come in, talk about it.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Gina, every time you speak, it's just all love, sis. Like your energy, your spirit, your dedication is always felt and inspiring as it was whenever we conceptualized this work together. I think it was 2017, 2018, maybe as future doctoras, as we call Stacey here, right? But yeah, like Gina so beautifully shared with us regarding, her experiences as a former faculty administrator in these spaces. Diversity, equity, and inclusion, nothing like the way historically white institutions make of it, right? Even after they've become HSIs on most occasion. And so for me, while I'm always thinking about organizational behavior, learning alongside and with Gina over the course of our doctoral studies together under the mentorship of Dr. Kefferlin Brown, right? Like we had a couple of classes together. At one point, Gina was my TA, right? I learned that DEI is really a matter of personhood, right? It's a matter of space and place. And HBCUs, as they grow, I think, should double down on this particular Afrocentric diversity they bring to the geographical regions that they serve in the broader landscape of higher education as open access, broad access institutions. So for me, the work was about where does the anti-Blackness lie within this current organizational structure, but also within the pressures that they are responding to in order to stay legitimated, right, amidst a landscape of institutions that they're competing with for legitimation, right? And so for me, yeah, I think that it is about doubling down into the Afrocentricity of what HBCUs bring to the HSI space. It's about doubling down on what they mean to even Afro-Indigenous folks, right? Like not just Indigenous folks, which are, if we understand the colonial history of Texas, is really Tejanos, right? But Afro-Indigenous people are precluded from accessing that home space, and they can regain some of that in an HBCU, emerging HSI space, if the orientation is as we're describing and putting forward in our conceptual framework, which is under review. So hopefully it's coming soon.
Yes.
Let's go. That's why they had to answer that, Gina. That's
Yes.
why right there.
And I love frameworks. If you know my work, I'm like a framework person. I'd be proposing all kind of frameworks. So bring it.
Yes, and we built on some of that work, Gina. I mean, like you know who you are. We don't have to say,
Thank you.
it's about hitting all those elements of servingness. I think that we get from your framework, but doing it in a way that honors what historically Black institutions have been doing in this field forever, right? Like since they were born, since they were conceived of. They have been diverse, but focused on centering a Black experience. And there is Blackness within Latinidad. There's indigeneity within Latinidad, and it is intentionally erased, right?
Come on. Come on. Okay.
That part. Absolutely. Well, good. I look forward to seeing the framework, right, in print and learning with y'all. And thank you for building on the work, right? That's the reality, is we should be building on each other's work, right? Honoring what's already been done and being like, all right, let's add on, right? Like let's diverge where it diverges, because they do, right? So thank you for that. By the way, Gina's voice is very powerful, but also the Zoom background is like fire. Y'all gonna have to log in to the video to see it. Because it goes with your power when you're speaking. So we're gonna bring Gina back in to talk about anti-Blackness. Let's talk about it, because we have had an episode on Que Pasa HSI. It's about anti-Blackness, season 3 with Whitney Pirtle, highly downloaded episode, because people are like, yeah, let's talk about it. What is it? How are we enacting it and doing it in HSI spaces? Because we absolutely are. And so let's bring that conversation back in, because it needs to be had, and particularly in this kind of conversation we're having, right? We know it's perpetual. We know it's ongoing. So what are your thoughts on disrupting anti-Blackness in spaces where Latinas are becoming the majority, right? And that's where we see it actually get perpetuated even more.
Yeah, I really appreciate that question. I kind of touched on this earlier when I was talking about, some of the complexities and how complicated, like this nuanceness that we have to traverse as we, emerge as Hispanic serving institutions. Historically, these institutions have been, this shelter, right, where they can engage in questions about, anti-Blackness within the Black community, right? So, you're at an HBCU, you're going to hear conversations about being too Black, not Black enough, right? You're going to see colorism, internalized Blacks, and anti-indigeneity in the Black community, and anti-Latinidad in the Black community. But you're going to do it in a space where you're doing it amongst, right, Blackness. And it's really important that as we emerge as HSIs, we just kind of unpack this construct, right, of what race is in the first place and how it has been used, right? We unlearn, right, anti-Blackness, anti-indigeneity, and we create a community that's so welcoming and affirming, right, that we can be vulnerable to have these honest and candid conversations about race, gender, ethnicity, sexuality, and so forth. And I think the faculty at HBCUs, they come from, I have the best faculty at HBCUs. We have no problem talking about race. Our students love to talk about race. And so I think, it just creates this, comunidades that's really so amenable to engaging in these conversations about who we are in relation to others and the world we live in. And this is what Natalie was speaking to earlier. And I'm coming from and even at because my sister, my niece, and my daughter also attended emerging HSI HBCU. And the one they attended had majority Latina students, but you go on campus and you still see like murals all over the place honoring its HBCU like lineage. And on campus, my sister, when she said she was taking first year seminar, and even in her, position on campus and her training for her job, she learned about the history of the institution. And in conversation with some of the faculty over there, like they also know that, though it's not documented like we would like it to be because of, the state we live in, it's hard to get documentation on Latina students because we weren't documented in the United States until the 80s. So you'll have we have this history of working together. You can see it clearly in our neighborhoods, right? Literally, we're living right next to each other. And so continuing to engage in these conversations in community is so important.
100. Whew. Anybody want to add on to the conversation around anti-Blackness? Because I know a lot of y'all have been thinking about it and writing about that. So any other thoughts on what we got to do? Because we got to keep talking about it, but that's not enough, right? How do we move beyond and or disrupt anti-Blackness?
I was gonna say that, like, it's just like a matter of being like, hey, I'm going to read as much as I can and learn as much as I can about different communities, not just my own community. I could have just continued teaching my class and not been intentional about finding ways in my curriculum to show this solidarity, right? And so it's about us being really intentional and showing each other as a collective, against white colonial settler, I said it backwards, but yeah, settler colonialism. So yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to add in on the organizational front, policy front around the anti-Blackness. So for me, the anti-Blackness is rooted in Special Rule 505, right? As Gina was saying, as you've said, Gina Garcia, right? These institutions have work to do still. They are still institutions that need work on decolonizing. They may have an anti-colonial approach and mission and historical legacy, but the decolonization is an everyday thing that needs working on and institutionalized and shoring up. And so it doesn't make sense to me, right, that these institutions are not receiving funds to improve the services for the populations of students that they have been serving forever and are increasingly serving, in particular in states like Texas, right? So I think what can be done to disrupt it is, leaders of HBCUs, students, alumni, faculty members, and I've learned in my research, this power is like decentralized in a real way where all of these people really do have to be involved in advocating for these institutions to receive funding of some sort to support these efforts. Because while Gina's amazing, right, and she's internally, intrinsically motivated to do something about it, that's not everybody's position, right? And not everybody is there at their HSI or emerging HSI to affect change within the institution in that way, right? They may be just there to teach in the business school. They may think that they're just there to teach a STEM class. It's unlikely you'll find these sentiments around, social sciences, but they may not understand or enough to be motivated to help the HBCU become an HSI in the way we want to see it. Right?
Yes, thank you for bringing in the policy perspective. I love that. I think we need to talk about that more, right? Because policy obviously is a lever for change, right? We need to think about the policies as we're thinking about this work, right? Like what policies can actually support the change, and which ones are hindering it, right? Because you bring up that too. It's like it could be hindering us from doing some of this work. So, or causing the anti-Blackness, right? Like or fueling it, I guess we would say.
Gina, I think as you know, like universities and colleges have a role in like the policy influence is not one directional, right? Especially in higher ed policy, which is kind of a non-thing. You know, we get in where we fit in and we try to make things work. But with that said, I think students, faculty, alumni at HBCUs, Black, American, Caribbean, Indigenous, they don't have the same power in those discussions that influence Title V right now, because they're not beneficiaries of the policy, really, right? So their voices don't hold the same weight, and yet they're competing with institutions, right, that have them kind of mimicking the way that they are going about serving this. If left up to that policy driver, right, I think there's resistance and agentic, thank goodness, agentic resistance in these spaces, according to our research. But the policy lever is still not doing what it could do.
Yeah. So with that, that leads right into my next question, which I wanted to ask you, because I know you've done a lot of work, right, with like working with policy intermediaries, which is a good way, right, to be like have that agency, right, to like change policy, right, and to sort of advocate, right, for a different policy. So what are your thoughts? And I love that, because I talk about that, right? I was like, we're gonna have to keep advocating for support for these institutions, right, and for the students in them. So what are your thoughts on you know, folks who are listening, who are practitioners, who are leaders, who are faculty in their role in working with policy intermediaries, and how they can do that to positively influence policy for Black, Latine, and Afro-Latine students?
I love this question. Like, I'm super excited about some of the work I'm doing to do just that. Number one, it's about coalition building. So I was trained by Liliana Garces, who is a former attorney, right? That's where my legal perspective comes from. That's where my policy affinity comes from. But also, Liliana is an amazing Colombian woman who shored up my scholarly identity in a very specific way, right? I don't know that many folks know that Jorge Bermicki, who is Stacey's dissertation chair and supervisor, you know, was a colleague of mine in my cohort at UT Austin. And so we just love on Stacey in a special kind of way that I think promotes solidarity around these issues, right? And disruption of some of these issues. Like I said, Gina and I have shared a similar mentor from curriculum and cultural studies. So a lot of the thinking that we have is just, you know, synergistic in that way. And then Natalie came in and like by way of Stacey. And so we have this super team here today that's able to say, yes, these institutions, one, deserve some awards for what they have been doing, right? And in fact, they're kind of a blueprint for what other institutions who are striving to be like them, whether they know it or not, can do that. But also, I'm collaborating with clinical faculty members at USC to take a big group of ethnically diverse Black students to the Hill for the Black Congressional Caucus coming up here soon. So it's about collaboration as far as I'm concerned, right? And collaborating in an emancipatory way, something I refer to as emancipatory relationality, and is undergirded really by Black feminist thought.
Excellent. I love it.
Woo!
And shout out to the people. Yes, it is beautiful. Shout out to the people you named too. Liliana Garces is an amazing, phenomenal scholar, and Jorge Bermicki got all kind of love in the room here. I know, Natalie, you wrote an article with him that's in the show notes. It's there, so folks can download that. And that's your advisor, Stacey? Nice. I like Jorge.
Yeah. And you know what's so crazy? That's why I'm like, even this episode in itself it was perfect timing, right? Like I started reading your work year 1 and had lots of questions, but it's now I'm nearing year 4, right? Almost the end of this PhD journey. And it's only now that we've come full circle where I brought the homies. Like, I met Dwuana and Gina through like my colleague that was like, yo, you need to hear what they're presenting at ASH. This is your work. And I'm like, what? She takes a screenshot and I'm like, oh my God, I found my soul sisters, right? And it was from that moment. And then it comes to find out that Dwuana and Bermicki were colleagues. And Bermicki's like, yes, you need to be with her. And I mean, and Natalie, our connection through Howard and both being from New York, right? Like this, I mean, it was just, this right here is the dream team for what we're talking about today. And it couldn't have been any other way. So I'm so thankful.
I'm thankful to be learning with y'all today. I love this. I wanted to have one last conversation before we get to the final question of the day, but we haven't specifically talked about the designation, how we want to call it, right? And we had a conversation before we started recording about what do we call this HBCU crossover with HSI? That's what I'm gonna call it. I'm gonna call it a crossover. But Stacey, if you want to tell us what you think we should call this dual designation, and then we'll bring Dwuana in to give us your perspective.
Yeah, sure. So I personally love the HB-HSI. So that represents a historically Black Hispanic serving institution. And I intentionally put the historically Black first because being taught and raised by HBCU, a lot like deference. Deference is big. You salute, you give deference to the ones that came before. And because they're historic, right? And we were founded first, so to speak, we were the first MSI, right, to be birthed out of this congressional kind of, lineage of MSIs. They belong first. So that's what I'm going to call it. I'm going to call it the Historically Black Hispanic Serving Institution.
So I have a little iteration on Stacey's, and I refer to them as Historically Black Emerging HSIs, lowercase e in the middle. And I do that because I'm mostly coming from a policy perspective, right? And the question I always get is, can they be federally designated as dual, serving institutions? And the answer is no. So I don't want to be confusing to the audience that I write for, and also want to show the difference, right? So I want the historically Black first. When again, going back to the disruption, for me, it was critical. I'm slow to even publish some of this work without the right team of people and voices positioned in the work, right, at the center of the work. So State Special Rule 505, people agree with me, and it is a little anti-Black and anti-Indigenous, right? And it does go under some sort of modification. To me, it's most and more important that Black, American, Afro-Latine, Afro-Indigenous voices are at the center of what those modifications look like, right? That I think is the way we really disrupt some of this stuff. For me, that really undergirds why I have to call them historically Black emerging HSIs. So that's never forgotten.
I like it. I like both, and both make a lot of sense. So we're gonna keep having this conversation with this group right here and others who are gonna follow and join y'all in this research, because I know there are gonna be others that are gonna hear this episode and be like, oh, it's such a good conversation to be having. So I'm excited to have been here with y'all today. You got to answer the final question though. Nobody gets out of the pod without answering the final question of the day, which is, ¿Qué pasa, HSIs? So I'm gonna call Natalie in so we can hear your voice again. ¿Qué pasa, HSIs?
So, ¿Qué pasa, HSIs? I would say we really, really, really need to start including Afro-Latinos into our curriculums, into our cafeterias in terms of like food diversity, right? Into our sporting events. Right. So one of the things that the students asked for when I asked them to dream about an inclusive HSI, they talked about wanting soccer at their HBCU, or they talk about, wanting yarroa, which is like a typical Dominican dish in their cafeteria. They talked about, wanting more access to Afro-Latino curriculums, more access to Afro-Latino faculty, more access to Afro-Latino therapists, right? Because even being in the HBCU space, there's still some lateral oppression happening. And Gina mentioned earlier, like there's this scarcity mindset that puts Blacks against Latinos, right? And so how do we start to build those bridges? Part of that is going to therapy, but also having a therapist that you can relate to, that can understand the tensions of being Black, Latinx, and American, and how in the United States, there's so much of a binary of you either have to be Black or you have to be white, that were often erased and often felt to unbelong, right? Not only within the United States, but in Black communities and even sometimes in Latinx communities, right? And so I would say to HSIs to really start thinking outside of the box, to paying attention to the needs of your specific communities, right? There's a lot of Afro-Latinos in the Northeast of the US. HSIs in the Northeast really need to be calling in their Afro-Latinx students, right? And even thinking about unlearning homophobia, especially within Black and Brown communities. And we don't talk about it often, but it's a space that HBCUs really need to work on too, right? Because you can't claim to be Pan-African if you don't also love our Black LGBTQIA brothers, sisters, gender non-binary groups as well. And so that's what I would say, is to really start thinking about the diversity within Afro-Latinidad, the diversity within Blackness, the diversity within Latinidad, right? And stop making it seem like everybody has to fit into this box, right? That there's this stereotypical version of what a perfect Afro-Latino looks like. Like, no, all of our colonial histories are different. All of our, work on decolonizing is different. And we need to start recognizing that, and not just centering, like you said earlier, Gina, not just centering the academics, because you can graduate and have all A's and still not have knowledge of self, still not feel like your words or your mind are valued in the workplace, still not have the confidence or the self-esteem to get that job in the boardroom, right? Because you don't have that power of ancestral knowledge. And so we need to start thinking about a holistic academic success, not just numbers, not just, oh, can you computate this? Like, no, do you know about your ancestry? Do you know about your history? Are you confident about who you are, right? And, do you have, solidarity in terms of the different identities and the intersectionalities that all exist in us as multifaceted people from the diaspora?
Whew, she took us to church on that one. Stacey, let's bring you in. ¿Qué pasa, HSIs?
All right, listen, we ain't going to iglesia on this one, but it's real quick and simple, right? So my call is this. HSI presidents, directors, VPs, coordinators, I encourage y'all to pick up the phone, send an email, or arrange a meeting with your nearest HBCU president, VP, coordinator, director, right? Because together we could forge that powerful partnership that enriches the institution and it uplifts the community. Boom.
Ooh,
Ahí.
yes. Boom. Drop it.
And
Gina.
I was going to say the same thing. I was like, because, teaching and working at a historically Black HSI, I had a lot of support from our neighbors who are at HSI across the street. So if you're not writing a letter or something, right, reach out to your local HBCU-HSI, learn, all right? Learn and build and, engage in a radically inclusive solidarity acts. And it doesn't have to be like this big thing. Just do something. Just do something.
All right, that's 2 votes for pick up the phone and call somebody and get some help.
Okay.
Sheesh, ask some support. Dwuana, same question. ¿Qué pasa, HSIs?
¿Qué pasa the HSIs? Like, I want to know, first of all, the same thing my 2 sisters before me just asked, when you're going to call your Black Latinx brothers and sisters at your nearest HBCU, right? Especially in Texas, they're outnumbered 1 to 37, right? So let's again build some coalitions. But my response is double down. Presidents must always be advocating for funding based on the unique value historically Black emerging HSIs bring to the entire landscape of higher ed, with an emphasis on the unique funding disparities between historically white and historically Black HSIs. I think in doing that, we can actually put more resources behind all of what Natalie was bringing to the forefront, right? When she answered the question, ¿Qué pasa HSIs? And because she was talking about the Black ones. And so they need that support, right? They need it particularly when their neighbors who are HSIs, but historically white, are shutting down their multicultural affairs centers in response to the attacks on DEI that are nationwide. So that's my last question to HSI.
Yes, and that's what's up. Thank you all for being here. Doctora's future doctora. We love this. Love to hear it. Beautiful episode.